The woman came to room 412 of St. Catherine's Hospital every afternoon at exactly 3 o'clock, carrying a canvas tote bag filled with books. She came on Mondays and Tuesdays and Wednesdays and Thursdays and Fridays, and on Saturdays and Sundays she came at noon instead, because visiting hours started earlier on weekends. She came in rain that turned the city into a gray watercolor, and in summer heat that made the hospital corridors shimmer with the smell of disinfectant and warm linoleum. She came when she was well, and she came when she was sick, once arriving with a fever of 39 degrees that the nurses noticed and tried to send her home for, and she refused with a quiet stubbornness that surprised everyone, because she was, in every other respect, the most agreeable woman any of them had ever met. Her name was Margaux Thibault. She was 30 years old, a librarian at the city's Central Public Library, and she had been coming to room 412 every day for 731 consecutive days. She had not missed a single one. The patient in room 412 was named Seraphina Contarini. She was 35, or had been 35 when the coma began. Her birthday had passed twice since then, marked only by the flowers that appeared on her bedside table from an unsigned card and the silent attention of the machines that monitored her vital signs with the indifferent precision of technology that does not care whether its subject lives or dies, only that the data is recorded accurately. Seraphina had been in the coma for 2 years, 1 month, and 16 days. She had been hit by a car on a Tuesday evening while crossing a street in the Old Quarter, a street she crossed every day on her walk home from the bookshop she owned, a small beautiful shop called Pagina that specialized in rare editions and first printings and the kind of literary fiction that requires a particular type of reader, the type who reads not for escape, but for the deeper engagement with reality that only great writing can provide. The car had struck her at 40 kilometers per hour, a speed that should not have been fatal, but that had sent her head against the curb at an angle that the doctors described, with the clinical detachment of people who deal in catastrophe daily, as profoundly unlucky. She had been in a coma ever since. Margaux had not known Seraphina before the accident. She had known of her. Everyone in the literary community of this mid-sized coastal city knew of Pagina, knew of the elegant woman who ran it, who hosted readings and signing events, and who curated her collection with an eye so sharp that getting a recommendation from Seraphina Contarini was the equivalent of a Michelin star for a book. But they had never met. They had existed in adjacent worlds, the public library and the independent bookshop, the institutional and the artisanal. And their paths had never crossed. They crossed at St. Catherine's in the hallway outside room 412 on a Thursday afternoon 2 years ago when Margaux was visiting her mother. Margaux's mother had been in the hospital for a hip replacement, a routine surgery, a predictable recovery, the kind of medical event that disrupts a family for a few weeks and then recedes into the category of things that happened and are over. Margaux had been visiting every afternoon, bringing books because her mother was a reader and because Margaux was a librarian, and books were the language they shared, the currency of their affection. She would sit in her mother's room and read aloud while her mother dozed and the machines beeped and the hospital moved around them with the continuous, low-grade urgency of a place where people were simultaneously being saved and lost. On that Thursday, she had stepped into the hallway to stretch her legs and had walked past room 412 and seen through the open door a woman lying motionless in a bed, surrounded by machines. The woman was beautiful, even in unconsciousness, even with the tubes and the wires and the clinical setting that stripped dignity from the living and imposed a terrible neutrality on the barely alive. The woman was beautiful. Dark hair spread across the pillow like ink on white paper, high cheekbones and a straight nose and lips that were slightly parted as if she had been about to say something when the world interrupted her. What caught Margaux's attention was the book. On the bedside table, next to the water pitcher and the tissue box and the unsigned flowers, there was a book. It was a novel. Margaux recognized it immediately. A French literary novel that had won the Prix Goncourt the previous year. A book she had read and loved and recommended to dozens of library patrons. The bookmark was placed at page 93, which meant that the woman in the bed had been reading it when whatever had happened to her had happened, and the book had been brought to the hospital by someone who understood that a reader's unfinished book is a form of unfinished business. A conversation interrupted mid-sentence. Margaux stood in the doorway and looked at the book and the woman and felt something shift in her chest, a tectonic adjustment, the kind of deep structural movement that happens beneath the surface and rearranges everything above it. She walked into the room. She picked up the book. She opened it to page 93, and she began to read aloud. She read for 40 minutes. She read the rest of the chapter and the beginning of the next, and her voice, which was warm and steady, and carried the particular music of someone who loves language and has spent a lifetime in its company, filled the room and moved across the machines and the tubes and the motionless body of Seraphina Contarini. And whether the sound reached her or not, whether it penetrated the coma and found whatever remained of the woman who had been reading this same book on the evening she was struck by a car, Margaux could not know. But she read, and when she finished, she placed the bookmark at page 137 and put the book back on the bedside table and left the room and went back to her mother and did not tell anyone what she had done. She came back the next day, and the next, and the next. Margaux Thibault was not the kind of woman who did dramatic things. She was, by her own description and by the assessment of everyone who knew her, ordinary. She was medium height, with warm brown hair that she wore in a loose bun, secured by whatever writing instrument was closest at hand. A pencil, a pen, once a chopstick from a takeaway lunch that she forgot was there until a colleague pointed it out. She had green eyes behind round wire-rimmed glasses that she cleaned obsessively with the hem of her cardigan, and freckles across her nose and cheeks that multiplied in summer and retreated in winter as if they too had seasonal habits. She wore cardigans in every color, layered over vintage dresses that she found at charity shops, paired with comfortable shoes because a librarian spends most of her life on her feet, and vanity is a luxury reserved for people who sit down. She lived alone in a small apartment above a bakery in the Old Quarter, 3 blocks from the library where she worked and 7 blocks from St. Catherine's Hospital. The apartment smelled permanently of fresh bread, which she considered the greatest luxury of her life. Better than a view, better than modern appliances, better than the updated bathroom that her landlord kept promising and never delivering. She had a cat named Dostoevsky, Dossie for short, a large orange tabby with the disposition of a Russian novelist, moody, profound, and fundamentally concerned with suffering. She had shelves on every wall, books in every room, a reading lamp beside every chair, and a bedside table stacked with the 7 books she was currently reading simultaneously, because Margaux did not believe in reading 1 book at a time any more than she believed in having 1 conversation at a time or 1 thought at a time. The mind was capable of multiplicity, and books were the medium through which she exercised that capacity. She had no partner. She had dated intermittently throughout her 20s, men and women who were attracted to her warmth and her intelligence, and then gradually disconcerted by her self-sufficiency, by the completeness of a life that did not seem to require another person to fill it. She was not lonely, or if she was, the loneliness was of the comfortable kind that a person who is genuinely content with their own company carries lightly, more of a preference than a wound. Her daily rhythm was precise. She woke at 6, fed Dossie, made coffee, read for 45 minutes. She walked to the library and worked from 9 to 2, shelving, cataloging, helping patrons find books, running the children's reading program on Tuesday mornings, curating the monthly display in the lobby window. At 2 she clocked out. At 2:15 she stopped at the hospital cafeteria for a cup of tea. At 2:45 she was in the hallway, outside room 412. At 3 she began reading. She brought a different book each week. She chose them carefully, with the same curatorial instinct that she applied to the library displays. Not random selections, but considered choices. Books that she believed a woman who owned a literary bookshop would appreciate. Books that honored Seraphina's taste, as Margaux understood it from the collection that had been on the Pagina shelves in the months before the accident. She read literary fiction, poetry, memoir, essays. She read authors from 6 continents in translation. She read new publications, and she read classics, and she read, once, the entire collected works of a poet whose name she had found inscribed on the flyleaf of the book that had been on Seraphina's bedside table. A personal inscription, intimate, suggesting that the poet and Seraphina had been friends. The nurses at St. Catherine's learned to expect her. They called her the reading lady, and then, as the weeks became months and the months became a year, they called her Margaux, and they saved her a chair when the room was being cleaned, and they told her, when Seraphina's vitals changed, when her blood pressure dipped, when her brain activity showed the faint, irregular patterns that might or might not indicate dreaming, when the doctors adjusted her medication or revised their prognosis. There were days when Margaux doubted, not the act itself. She never doubted the reading, never questioned whether it was worth doing, but the larger architecture of her devotion. She would sit in the chair beside Seraphina's bed and read a passage of extraordinary beauty and look at the motionless face on the pillow and wonder whether the words were reaching anything, whether the voice was penetrating the layers of neurological damage, whether she was reading to a woman or to an absence. On those days, the reading felt like prayer, an act performed not because the recipient could hear it, but because the performer needed to believe that someone was listening. She told no one about her daily visits. Her colleagues at the library knew she went to the hospital regularly, but they assumed it was volunteer work, the kind of structured charitable activity that libraries encourage their staff to participate in. Her mother, in the rare moments of lucidity that her condition still permitted, asked about Margaux's life, and Margaux described the library and the apartment and Dossie the cat, but did not mention room 412, because explaining Seraphina would require explaining a connection that defied conventional logic. How do you tell someone that you have spent 2 years reading to a stranger, that this stranger has become the most important person in your daily life, that the act of reading aloud in a hospital room has given your existence a purpose and a structure that nothing else has provided? She could not explain it because she could not fully understand it herself. She only knew that every day at 3 o'clock, when she opened the door to room 412 and saw Seraphina's face on the pillow and the book waiting on the bedside table, something inside her settled into place, the way a key settles into a lock it was made for. This was where she was supposed to be. This was what her voice was supposed to do. And the feeling was so strong, so certain, so deeply embedded in the daily rhythm of her life, that the prospect of losing it, through Seraphina's recovery, or Seraphina's death, or some administrative decision that revoked her visiting privileges, filled her with a dread that she recognized as the dread of losing one's purpose, one's calling, the thing that transforms survival into life. The prognosis was not good. It had never been good. The doctors spoke in percentages and probabilities that decreased over time the way light decreases at dusk. Gradually, then suddenly, then completely. After 2 years, the likelihood of Seraphina emerging from the coma was, by medical consensus, negligible. The machines kept her body alive. The nurses maintained her physical condition with the professional care that the hospital's reputation demanded. But the woman who had owned Pagina, who had curated books and hosted readings and walked home through the old quarter on a Tuesday evening, was, in every meaningful medical sense, gone. Margaux read to her anyway. She read to her because the reading had become something more than a charitable act, more than the kindness of a stranger. It had become a practice, a ritual, a form of faith. Not religious faith. Margaux was not religious, but something adjacent to it, the belief that presence matters even when it produces no measurable result, that the act of showing up is its own justification, that reading words aloud into a room where someone lies between life and death is not futile but sacred, an insistence that the human connection between a voice and a listener does not require consciousness to be real. The man who paid for room 412, for the private room, for the specialists, for the round-the-clock nursing care that kept Seraphina Contarini's body alive, was named Alessio Contarini, and he was Seraphina's husband, and he was the man who controlled the eastern districts of the city with an authority that was both absolute and invisible. Alessio was 38 years old. He was tall and lean, with the build of a man who had once been an athlete, and now maintained his body through discipline rather than passion. Early morning runs along the coastal road, the kind of punishing physical routine that people adopt when they need to exhaust their bodies to survive their minds. He had black hair that he wore swept back from a high forehead, sharp cheekbones, and eyes that were green-gray, the color of the sea on an overcast day, beautiful and cold and constantly calculating. His face was angular, almost severe, softened only by a full lower lip that suggested a sensuality that the rest of his demeanor worked hard to suppress. He dressed in dark tailored suits, charcoal navy, black, with the understated precision of a man who understood that true power does not need to advertise itself. He had met Seraphina at Pagina. He had walked into her bookshop on a rainy Wednesday afternoon, looking for a gift for his mother's birthday, and Seraphina had recommended a novel with such passionate conviction that he had bought it and read it that night, not because he was a reader, he was not or had not been, but because the woman who recommended it had spoken about the book with an intensity that made him want to understand what she understood, to see what she saw, to access the world inside her mind through the portal of the pages she had pressed into his hands. He returned to the shop the following week, and the week after. He came every Wednesday for 3 months, buying books he might never have chosen on his own, reading them with the dedicated attention of a man who has discovered a new form of intelligence, and falling in love with the woman who gave them to him with the slow inevitability of a man who recognizes that he has met the person who makes the rest of the world make sense. They married a year later. The wedding was small, Seraphina's choice, not his, held in the garden of a villa overlooking the sea, with 40 guests and a string quartet and enough flowers to fill a cathedral. Seraphina wore a dress that looked like it was made of light, and Alessio stood at the altar and watched her walk toward him, and understood that he had been given something he did not deserve, something that the violence and calculation of his professional life should have disqualified him from. And he made a private vow alongside the public ones, that he would protect her from every consequence of who he was, that his world would never touch her, that the woman who loved books and language and beauty would never have to see the ugliness that funded her life. He kept that vow for 4 years. Then a car hit his wife on a Tuesday evening, and she fell, and her head struck the curb, and the world that Alessio had built to protect her collapsed into the space between one heartbeat and the next. If this story is already pulling at something inside you, if you can feel the weight of 2 years of silence and the woman who filled it with words, subscribe to Crimson Vow Tales right now. Hit that notification bell, because what happens next is something you will not be ready for. The accident was not an accident. Alessio knew this within 72 hours. The car had been stolen, the driver never found, and the timing. Seraphina was struck on the same day. Alessio had refused a partnership proposal from a man named Tomas Varga. Was too precise to be coincidence. Varga controlled the western docks and had been pushing to consolidate with Alessio's eastern operations for months. Alessio's refusal had been polite but absolute. The car that hit Seraphina was Varga's response. Alessio did not retaliate immediately. He was a strategic man, a patient man, a man who understood that revenge executed in grief is revenge that creates more problems than it solves. He sat beside Seraphina's hospital bed for the first 3 months, holding her hand, reading to her from the books she had left unfinished. He was a poor reader aloud, stumbling over words, losing the rhythm of sentences that she would have delivered with effortless grace. And he waited for her to wake up because the doctors said there was a chance, in those early weeks, that the swelling would subside and the brain would repair and the woman he loved would open her eyes and return to him. She did not wake up. The weeks became months, and the chance became smaller, and Alessio's visits became less frequent, not because he loved her less, but because the visits were destroying him. Because sitting beside her bed, watching the machines breathe for her, was a form of torture that even a man accustomed to violence could not endure indefinitely. He reduced his visits to Sundays, then to the first Sunday of each month, then to holidays and anniversaries and the occasional Tuesday evening when the weight of what had happened on a Tuesday evening became too heavy to carry without seeing her face. He maintained the room, he paid the bills, he ensured that the best specialists reviewed her case quarterly. He sent flowers on her birthday with an unsigned card because signing it felt like an admission that their relationship had been reduced to a one-sided correspondence between the living and the almost dead. And he did not know, had no way of knowing, that every afternoon at 3 o'clock, a woman with brown hair in a loose bun and round glasses and a canvas tote bag full of books sat in the chair beside Seraphina's bed and read aloud for 2 hours, filling the room with words and stories and the particular warmth of a human voice that has made a practice of companionship, and that this woman had been doing this every single day for 2 years, while he, the husband, the man who had vowed to protect her, could barely bring himself to enter the room once a month. The discovery happened because of a doctor named Patel. Dr. Ria Patel was Seraphina's neurologist, a precise woman in her 50s who had been monitoring the case from the beginning and who had, in the way that medical professionals do when a patient persists in the gray area between life and death for long enough, developed a research interest in Seraphina's condition. She had been studying the effects of auditory stimulation on comatose patients, a growing field that explored whether sustained exposure to familiar or emotionally significant sounds could influence brain activity patterns in patients with severe traumatic brain injuries. Dr. Patel had installed a small recording device in room 412 6 months ago, with the hospital's approval and the family's blanket consent for medical monitoring. The device was designed to capture ambient sound continuously, creating a record that could be cross-referenced with the real-time brain activity data from Seraphina's monitors. The hypothesis was straightforward. If certain sounds correlated with increased neural activity, those sounds could be identified and administered therapeutically. What Dr. Patel found in 6 months of recordings was Margaux. Hours and hours and hours of Margaux. Her voice reading novels and poetry and essays and memoirs. Her voice pausing to turn pages, clearing her throat, occasionally commenting on a passage. "Oh, Sarah, you would love this part." Or, "I think you would disagree with him here, but let me keep going and you can argue with me when you wake up." Her voice, warm and steady and present, filling the silence of room 412 with the companionship that Seraphina's husband could not provide and that the medical staff did not have time for. Dr. Patel cross-referenced the recordings with the brain activity data and found something remarkable. During Margaux's reading sessions, Seraphina's brain showed consistent patterns of increased activity. Subtle, but measurable. A gentle rise in the neural rhythms that the machines tracked with their cold precision. The activity was most pronounced during passages of particular emotional intensity, and during the moments when Margaux addressed Seraphina directly, when she said, "Sarah," or "Listen to this," or "I brought you something special today." The brain of a woman who had been in a coma for 2 years was responding, however faintly, to the voice of a stranger who read to her every afternoon. Dr. Patel called Alessio Contarini. She explained the findings. She played him a sample of the recordings. Alessio sat in Dr. Patel's office with his phone pressed to his ear and listened to a woman's voice reading to his wife, and the sound entered him like a blade, not because it was painful, but because it was beautiful. Because this unknown woman was doing the thing he had tried to do and failed at. The thing he had given up on. The thing he had reduced to monthly visits and unsigned flowers. She was being present. She was being faithful. She was showing up every day and reading with a tenderness and an intelligence and a commitment that put his own devotion to shame. "Who is she?" he asked. And his voice was controlled, but Dr. Patel, who had been treating patients for 30 years and could read the emotional registers of a voice the way a musician reads sheet music, heard the fracture beneath the control. "A volunteer reader, a librarian. She's been coming every day since almost the beginning. Every day. Every single day. 731 consecutive visits as of yesterday. The nurses confirm it. She has never missed a day." Alessio ended the call. He sat in his car in the hospital parking lot for a long time. The parking lot was half empty, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the asphalt, and he sat behind the wheel with the engine off and the windows up and the recording still playing in his memory. That warm, steady voice saying things to his wife that he had never said, expressing a devotion that he had never expressed, being present in a way that he had never been present. The contrast was annihilating. He gripped the steering wheel until his scarred knuckles went white, and he pressed his forehead against his hands, and he stayed there for 20 minutes, motionless, processing the information the way a computer processes data that is too large for its system, struggling to accommodate the sheer volume of what he now understood about his own failure and this stranger's grace. Then he drove to his office in the Eastern District, the office above the import company that served as the legitimate face of his operations, and he called his head of security. "I need you to find someone for me," he said. "A woman, a librarian. She visits St. Catherine's Hospital every afternoon. I need her name, her address, everything." The information came back within 2 hours. Margaux Thibault, age 30, librarian at the Central Public Library. Lives alone above a bakery in the Old Quarter. No criminal record, no connections to any organization. No apparent motive for spending 2 years reading to a comatose stranger other than the one motive that Alessio's world had trained him to distrust. Simple, uncomplicated kindness. He did not approach her. Not yet. He needed to understand before he confronted, needed to absorb the shape of this woman's devotion before he could face her with the full knowledge of his own failure. He spent 3 days researching Margaux Thibault, not through his organization's intelligence network, but through the public traces she had left. Her profile on the library's website, where she was photographed smiling beside a display of recommended reads. Her infrequent social media presence, which consisted almost entirely of photographs of books and cats and the view from her apartment window. A brief article in the local newspaper about a reading program she had organized for elderly residents at a care home, in which she was quoted saying something that stopped Alessio's breath in his chest. Reading aloud is not about the reader, it's about the listener. Even if the listener can't respond, the act of being read to is the act of being accompanied, and no one should have to be alone with their silence. No one should have to be alone with their silence. He read the quote 3 times. He thought about Seraphina alone in room 412 with the machines breathing for her and the silence pressing in from every wall. And he thought about this woman, this ordinary, extraordinary woman who had decided that Seraphina would not be alone, who had walked into a hospital room because a book was open to page 93, and who had not walked out for 2 years. He thought about himself, about the monthly visits, about the unsigned flowers, about the distance he had maintained between his body and his wife's hospital bed, because proximity to her coma was proximity to his own helplessness, and helplessness was the one thing a man like Alessio Contarini could not tolerate. He had controlled the eastern districts of an entire city. He had managed operations that moved millions through the port and the commercial centers. He had maintained alliances and neutralized threats and built a reputation that made men speak his name with careful respect. And he could not sit beside his wife's bed and read her a book. He could not do the simple, human, unglamorous thing that a librarian with green eyes and ink-stained fingers had done every day for 731 days. The shame of it was physical. It sat in his stomach like a stone, and it stayed there. Instead, he went to the hospital. He went on a Tuesday afternoon at 2:30, 30 minutes before Margaux typically arrived, and he sat in the chair beside Seraphina's bed and looked at his wife's face and saw, for the first time in months, the small signs of care that he had been too infrequent a visitor to notice. The fresh flowers. Not his, someone else's modest wildflower arrangements in a jar rather than the expensive bouquets he sent. The book on the bedside table with a library bookmark at its current page. The soft blanket draped over Seraphina's feet that was not hospital issue but hand-knitted. The kind of gesture that spoke of someone who thought about comfort in specific personal terms. Margaux had made this room into something more than a hospital room. She had made it into a space where someone lived, where someone was cared for, where the cold institutional reality of a coma ward had been softened by the presence of a person who refused to treat the patient as already gone. Alessio sat in the chair and held Seraphina's hand and felt, for the first time in 2 years, something other than guilt and grief. He felt gratitude, and beneath the gratitude, something else. Curiosity, fascination, the pull toward a person he had never met whose devotion to his wife exceeded his own. He left before 3. He passed Margaux in the corridor without knowing it, a woman with brown hair in a bun, glasses, a heavy tote bag, a cardigan the color of autumn leaves. And she passed him without knowing him, a tall man in a dark suit with haunted green-gray eyes, and they moved through each other's gravitational fields without collision, 2 bodies in orbit around the same motionless center, unaware that the geometry of their lives was about to change. In the days that followed his visit to room 412, Alessio found himself unable to concentrate. He sat in meetings with his lieutenants and heard nothing. He reviewed financial projections and the numbers blurred. He stood at the window of his office overlooking the port and watched the cargo ships move through the harbor and thought about a canvas tote bag full of books, about a hand-knitted blanket folded at the foot of a hospital bed, about the specific quality of care that turns a hospital room into something resembling a home. He thought about the woman who had done this, not with money, not with power, not with the vast resources that Alessio commanded, but with the simplest tools available to a human being, her time, her voice, and her unwillingness to let someone be alone. The contrast between her devotion and his absence was a wound that did not stop bleeding. He had told himself for 2 years that his distance was a form of protection, that visiting less frequently spared him the corrosive grief of watching Seraphina die by inches, that maintaining the room and paying the bills was its own form of devotion, expressed in the language of money because the language of presence was too painful to speak. He had told himself these things and believed them, or convinced himself he believed them, because the alternative, admitting that he was a coward, that the man who commanded an empire was afraid to sit beside his wife's bed and hold her hand, was too devastating to face. Margaux Thibault had faced it every day for 2 years. She had faced the grief and the futility and the slow, terrible diminishment of a woman she had never met when she was whole, and she had not looked away, had not reduced her visits, had not retreated into the comfortable distance that Alessio had adopted. She had leaned in. She had brought books and flowers and blankets and birthday cake and the full, uncompromised force of her humanity, and she had done it without expectation of reward or recognition or even acknowledgement. He needed to understand why. Not the charitable explanation, not the answer she might give to a journalist or a hospital administrator about the therapeutic benefits of reading aloud to coma patients. He needed to understand the real why, the personal why, the thing that had made this woman choose room 412 as the center of her life for 731 consecutive days. He went back to the recordings. Dr. Patel gave him access to the full archive. 6 months of daily sessions, over 500 hours of Margaux's voice. And he listened to them in his study at night, the way a man in another story had listened to music through a wall. He listened to Margaux read novels he had never heard of, poets whose names he could not pronounce, essays that opened doors in his mind he had not known were closed. He listened to the way she read, not the flat recitation of someone performing a duty, but the engaged, responsive reading of someone who was having a conversation with the text, who paused at beautiful sentences and let them breathe, who varied her pace and her tone to match the emotional contour of whatever she was reading. And he listened to the way she spoke to Seraphina, the direct addresses, the asides, the casual intimacy of a one-sided friendship that had been sustained for 2 years through sheer force of will and affection. Sarah, I found this at a charity shop yesterday, and I thought of you immediately. It's a first edition. Can you imagine? In a charity shop. The spine is damaged, but the pages are perfect, and it smells like someone's library, like old paper and dust and knowledge. I had a terrible day today, Sarah. A patron yelled at me about a late fee, and I wanted to explain that the fee exists, because other people want to read the book too. And keeping it past its date is a form of selfishness. But, of course, I didn't say that because I'm a librarian, and we are constitutionally incapable of being rude to patrons, even when they deserve it. Happy birthday, Sarah. I brought you a cake from the bakery downstairs from my apartment. I know you can't eat it, but I'm going to eat a slice for you and describe how it tastes, because that's basically the same thing. It's chocolate. It's extremely good. You would love it. I miss you today. I know that's strange to say to someone I never met when you were awake, but I miss you. I miss the version of you that would be sitting in this chair instead of lying in that bed, the version that would be telling me I'm reading too slowly, or choosing the wrong books, or that my French accent is atrocious, which it probably is. I miss the conversation we've never had. Alessio listened to these recordings and felt something happen inside him that he had not anticipated and could not control. He was falling in love with a voice, not romantically, not yet, not in the simple sense, but in the way that a man who has been living in silence for 2 years falls in love with sound itself, with the proof that warmth exists, that kindness exists, that someone in the world was capable of the sustained, unglamorous, unrewarded devotion that he himself had failed to maintain. We are deep in this story now, and everything you think you know is about to shift. If Margaux's voice is in your head, if you can feel the weight of what Alessio is about to do, subscribe to Crimson Vow Tales and hit that like button. Drop a comment telling me, have you ever been moved by a stranger's kindness? I read every single one. He decided to meet her. Not through his organization, not through the channels of power and surveillance that would have allowed him to arrange the encounter with precision and control. He decided to meet her the way any person meets another, by showing up. He went to the library. The Central Public Library was a building that Alessio had passed 1,000 times and never entered, a grand stone structure with arched windows and a carved motto above the entrance that read, in Latin, something about knowledge and freedom. He walked through the doors at 10 in the morning on a Wednesday, wearing his darkest suit, feeling conspicuously out of place among the students and retirees and parents with children who populated the reading rooms, with the easy familiarity of people for whom this building was a second home. He found her at the reference desk. She was helping a teenager locate a source for a school project, leaning over the desk with a pencil tucked behind her ear and her glasses sliding down her nose, pointing at something on a computer screen with the focused patience of a person who genuinely cared whether a 16-year-old found the right information. Her cardigan was dark green. Her hair was coming loose from its bun. She had ink on her fingers. He waited until the teenager left. Then he approached the desk, and Margaux looked up at him with the professional smile of a librarian greeting a patron, and the smile faltered slightly when she registered the intensity of his gaze, the quality of his suit, the contained energy of a man who was not here for a book. "Can I help you?" she asked, and her voice, the voice he had been listening to for weeks in recordings, the voice that had read to his wife for 2 years, the voice that had spoken to Seraphina with more tenderness than he had managed in all the years of their marriage. Her voice was even more beautiful in person, warmer, more textured, carrying the slight huskiness of someone who uses their voice professionally and is slightly worn by it, like a favorite book whose spine has been cracked by repeated reading. "I'm looking for a book," he said, because he had to say something, and the truth, "I'm looking for you. I've been listening to you read to my wife. I know you bring wildflowers and hand-knitted blankets and birthday cake to a woman you never met," was too enormous for a library reference desk. "What kind of book?" "Something for someone in the hospital, someone who can't read for themselves." He watched her face change. The professional smile deepened into something genuine, something that engaged her eyes and softened the line of her jaw, and transformed her from an ordinary woman at a desk into someone luminous, someone lit from within by the particular radiance of a person encountering their own passion in unexpected territory. "I know exactly what you mean," she said. "I actually do a lot of reading at St. Catherine's. What kind of books does the patient enjoy?" The moment hung between them like a held breath. He could tell her now. He could say, "The patient is my wife. You've been reading to her for 2 years. I've been listening to recordings of your voice, and it is the first thing in 700 days that has made me feel like the world is not entirely composed of loss." He did not say any of these things. He said, "Literary fiction, novels. She used to own a bookshop." Something flickered across Margaux's face. Recognition, realization, the connection forming behind her green eyes as she looked at this man in his dark suit with his haunted expression and understood who he was. She had seen the name on the hospital records. She had heard the nurses mention the husband who paid for everything, but rarely came. She knew. "You're Alessio," she said quietly, "Seraphina's husband. And you're Margaux, the woman who reads to her every day." The library hummed around them. Students typed on laptops. Children whispered in the reading corner. The clock on the wall ticked seconds into a silence that was not silence, but the gathering of something enormous, the accumulation of 2 years of parallel devotion, finally converging into a single point in space and time. "Why?" he asked, and the word was so small and the question so large that it seemed to crack the air between them. Margaux looked at him for a long time. She removed her glasses, cleaned them on the hem of her cardigan, a nervous habit he would learn, that she performed whenever she needed a moment to organize her thoughts, and put them back on. "Because the book was open to page 93, she said, "and someone needed to finish it for her." The simplicity of the answer undid him. He stood at the reference desk of the Central Public Library and felt his composure, the armor that 38 years of careful self-construction had built around him, the controlled exterior that his world required and his grief demanded. Crack, not break, crack. The way ice cracks when the temperature begins to shift, a surface fracture that reveals the depth of what has been frozen underneath. They began meeting at the hospital, not in room 412. Alessio could not yet bring himself to be in the room while Margaux read, the intimacy of it too raw, too exposing. But in the corridor afterward, and then in the hospital cafeteria, and then in the small garden behind the building where patients in wheelchairs sat among trimmed hedges and stone benches, Those first meetings had the careful quality of diplomatic negotiations between countries that had recently discovered they shared a border. Alessio was a man who controlled conversations the way he controlled territories, with strategy, with calculated disclosure, with an awareness of how information could be used as leverage. Margaux was a woman who communicated the way she read, openly, attentively, with the willingness to be surprised by what she encountered. They circled each other in the hospital cafeteria, navigating the complicated terrain of their connection over institutional coffee and plastic-wrapped sandwiches that neither of them ate. She asked about his work. He deflected with the practiced vagueness of a man whose professional life existed in spaces that polite conversation could not reach. Import-export, he said, which was technically true in the way that calling the ocean wet was technically true. She accepted the deflection with the perceptiveness of a woman who understood that some questions are asked not for their answers, but for the space they create, the invitation they extend. He asked about her life. She told him. About the library, about Dossie the cat, about the apartment above the bakery, about the children's reading program she ran on Tuesday mornings, where 6-year-olds sat on the carpet and listened to stories with the uncomplicated absorption that adults lose and spend the rest of their lives trying to recover. She told him about the particular joy of watching a child discover a book, the moment when the words on the page become more real than the room they are sitting in, when the child's eyes go wide and their mouth goes slack, and they enter the world of the story with the totality that only children and very serious readers can achieve. Sarah was like that, Margaux said, and the casualness of the nickname, Sarah, not Seraphina, the intimacy of abbreviation, sent a current through Alessio's chest. I could tell from the notes she left in her books. She read with that same totality. She didn't just read books. She inhabited them. She argued with them, annotated them, folded their corners. She treated books the way some people treat friends, with fierce loyalty and honest criticism and the expectation that they would make her better. Margaux told him about the books she had read to Seraphina. She described the progression, the early weeks when she had simply continued the novel that was already on the bedside table, then the months when she began bringing her own selections, choosing with increasing care as she developed what she called a reading relationship with Seraphina, an understanding of what the woman in the bed would want to hear, based on the library of books she had left behind in the shop, and the notes in the margins, and the dog-eared pages that revealed her tastes and her passions and her intellectual curiosities. She argued with Borges, Margaux said, and her face lit up when she talked about Seraphina's annotations, the way some people's faces light up when they describe a loved one. She wrote notes in the margins that disagreed with him. Who argues with Borges? Who has the confidence your wife did? She wrote. Nonsense, the map is never the territory, especially in fiction, in the margin of a Borges story, and I fell in love with her a little bit right then. Alessio listened. He listened the way he had listened to the recordings, with the concentrated attention of a man who was learning a language he should have learned years ago, the language of his wife's inner life, the world of books and ideas and passionate intellectual engagement that Seraphina had inhabited and that he had admired from the outside without ever truly entering. Margaux made him enter it. She recommended books, the way Seraphina had recommended books, not casually but with conviction, with the understanding that a book recommendation is a form of intimacy, an offering of something that has moved you with the hope that it will move someone else. He read them. He read them at night in his study, the same study where he had listened to her recordings, and the experience of reading books that Margaux had chosen for him created a strange doubling effect, as if he were simultaneously developing a relationship with Margaux and retroactively deepening the relationship he had failed to fully develop with Seraphina. 6 weeks after they met at the library, Seraphina's condition deteriorated. The change was subtle, a slight decline in the brain activity that Dr. Patel had been monitoring, a shift in the vital signs that the machines recorded with their impartial precision. The doctors convened. The prognosis was discussed. The words were clinical, but their meaning was not. Seraphina was dying. Not immediately, not dramatically, but in the slow, steady way that coma patients die when the body finally exhausts its ability to maintain a life that the mind has already abandoned. Alessio received the news in his office above the import company. He sat behind his desk, and with the phone still in his hand and the doctor's words still in his ear, and he felt the grief reopen like a wound that had never truly closed, a wound he had been covering with the activity and distance and the carefully maintained fiction that Seraphina might someday wake up. He called Margaux. It was the first time he had called her. Their communication had been limited to the hospital meetings and a few tentative text messages, the careful correspondence of two people who were aware that whatever was between them existed in the shadow of a woman lying in a hospital bed. Margaux answered on the second ring. "I know," she said before he could speak. "Dr. Patel called me too." "She called you?" "She considers me part of Seraphina's care team. I've been there every day for 2 years, Alessio. I'm listed as an authorized visitor. The nurses have my phone number." The fact that the hospital considered Margaux part of Seraphina's life while he, the husband, was a monthly visitor with unsigned flowers. This fact landed in his chest like a stone. "I don't know what to do," he said, and the admission cost him everything, because Alessio Contarini always knew what to do, had built an empire on the ability to assess situations and execute decisions and maintain control. And this, his wife dying by degrees in a room where a stranger had been more present than he had, was the one situation for which he had no strategy and no plan. "Come to the hospital," Margaux said. "Sit with her. I'll be there at 3. We'll read to her together." He went. He sat in room 412 for the first time in months, in the chair that Margaux usually occupied, and he held Seraphina's hand and looked at her face and saw what 2 years of absence had prevented him from seeing. The woman he loved was leaving, had been leaving for a long time, and the only person who had been there to accompany her on the journey was a librarian with green eyes and a tote bag full of books. Margaux arrived at 3. She pulled a second chair beside his and opened a book. A novel by a Japanese author about memory and loss, chosen with the devastating appropriateness of a woman who understood that the books you read to the dying are the books that help the living survive. And she began to read. Alessio listened. Not to the words, not really, but to the voice. The voice that had been Seraphina's companion for 2 years. The voice that had filled the room when he could not. The voice that had said, "Happy birthday, and I miss you, and I brought you cake," to a woman who could not hear or taste or respond, but who had, according to the brain activity data, responded anyway, had reached toward that voice through the layers of coma and unconsciousness and neurological damage with whatever remained of the woman she had been. He wept. Quietly, in the chair beside the bed, with Margaux's voice reading beside him, he wept for the wife he was losing and the years he had wasted and the stranger who had loved Seraphina better than he had. Seraphina died on a Sunday morning in October, when the sea outside the hospital windows was gray and calm, and the light had the thin golden quality that autumn brings to coastal cities. Margaux was in the room. Alessio was in the room. They were both there, on either side of the bed, Margaux reading and Alessio holding Seraphina's hand, when the monitors changed their rhythm and the nurses came in, and the machines that had been breathing for Seraphina for 2 years and 3 months stopped breathing, and the room became quiet in a way that was different from the quiet of a coma. A final quiet, an absolute quiet, the quiet of a story that has reached its last page. Margaux closed the book. She placed it on the bedside table beside the wildflowers and the hand-knitted blanket and all the accumulated evidence of 2 years of daily devotion. She looked at Seraphina's face, peaceful now in a way that it had not been before. the slight tension that coma maintains, the body's residual resistance to its own stillness, had relaxed into something that looked like rest, genuine rest, the rest of a person who has finally been allowed to put the book down and sleep. "I finished it, Sarah," Margaux whispered. "Every book. All of them. You can rest now." Alessio looked at Margaux across his wife's body and saw her grief, which was different from his. Not the grief of a husband who has lost a wife, but the grief of a reader who has lost a listener, a companion, a purpose. For 2 years, Margaux's life had been organized around room 412. Her schedule, her book selections, her emotional life, all of it had orbited Seraphina's bed the way planets orbit a star. And now the star had gone out, and Margaux was in the sudden darkness of a life without its organizing center. The funeral was held 4 days later. Alessio organized it with the controlled efficiency that was his default mode, the mode he retreated to when emotion threatened to overwhelm him. It was held at a church overlooking the sea, a small stone building with stained glass windows that turned the afternoon light into colors that looked like they belonged in a painting. The attendees were Alessio's people, men and women from his organization, business associates, the infrastructure of power that had surrounded his life with Seraphina without ever truly touching it. Margaux sat in the back row. She wore a dark dress and her cardigan and her round glasses, and she held a book in her lap. The last book she had been reading to Seraphina, the Japanese novel about memory, and she sat quietly among strangers and mourned a woman she had known only through the medium of silence and words. Alessio saw her from the altar. He saw her in the back row with her book and her grief and her quiet dignity, this woman who had been more faithful to his wife than he had, and something in his chest that had been frozen since the diagnosis cracked further, widened, opened into something that was not just gratitude and not just admiration, but the precursor to something he was not yet ready to name. After the funeral, after the mourners had dispersed and the church was empty, Alessio found Margaux standing outside, looking at the sea. The October wind was pulling strands of hair from her bun, and her glasses were spotted with sea spray, and she was crying in the quiet way he had come to associate with her, not dramatically, not performatively, but privately, the tears a conversation between herself and whatever it was she had lost. "What will you do now?" he asked. She looked at him. Her green eyes were red-rimmed but clear, the eyes of a woman who had spent 2 years preparing for this loss and was still not prepared. "I don't know," she said. "I've been going to that room every day for 2 years. My body doesn't know how to not go. Tomorrow at 2:45 I'm going to start walking toward the hospital, and I'm going to have to tell my feet to go somewhere else, and I don't know where that somewhere else is." She paused. The wind pulled another strand of hair from her bun, and she pushed it behind her ear, with the automatic gesture of someone who has been losing this particular battle against gravity for years. "Do you know what I realized? Sitting in that church just now?" I never heard her voice. 2 years, 731 days. I read to her for over 1,000 hours. I told her about my life, my cat, my terrible taste in romantic movies. I brought her birthday cake and wildflowers and hand-knitted blankets, and I never heard her say a single word. I don't know what her voice sounds like. I loved a woman whose voice I never heard. Alessio looked at her. This woman standing by the sea after his wife's funeral with tears on her freckled face and a book pressed against her heart, and he understood something that his grief and his guilt had been preventing him from seeing. Margaux's loss was real. Not lesser because she had never known Seraphina when she was awake. Not diminished because their relationship had been one-sided. Real. She had loved his wife in the particular way that devotion creates love. Not through reciprocity, but through commitment, through showing up, through the daily accumulation of care that eventually becomes indistinguishable from the deepest kind of affection. Her voice was beautiful, he said. She had a low voice, a little husky, and she laughed with her whole body. She would have loved you, Margaux. She would have sat in that hospital room and listened to you read, and she would have argued with your book choices and corrected your pronunciation and insisted that you were reading too fast during the good parts. She would have been your friend. She would have been your best friend. Margaux's face crumpled. The careful composure that had carried her through the funeral and the church and the procession broke apart, and she pressed the book against her face and sobbed. And Alessio did not touch her because he understood that some grief needs space rather than contact, but he stood beside her and let her grieve, and the sea moved behind them, and the autumn wind carried the sound of her crying out over the water. When she was done, she wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her cardigan and straightened her glasses and said, with the quiet practicality that he was beginning to recognize as her fundamental mode, "I'm sorry. That was a lot. Don't apologize for grief. It's the most honest thing a person can do." She looked at him with those green eyes, reddened and raw, and something passed between them that was not yet love, but was the soil from which love grows. Mutual recognition, mutual respect, the understanding that they had both been changed by the same woman, and that the change connected them in ways that neither of them fully understood. "Come to Pagina," he said. The word was out before he had planned it, before his strategic mind had vetted it, before the careful construction of his emotional armor had had time to intercept it. The bookshop. It's been closed since the accident. Everything is still there. The books, the shelves, the reading nook she built in the back. Someone should reopen it. Someone who loves books the way she did. Margaux stared at him. The wind blew. The sea moved. The last of the funeral flowers trembled in the stone urns by the church door. "That's Seraphina's shop," she said. It was. She would want it to live. She would want someone to carry it forward who understood what it was. Not just a business, but a conversation between books and the people who need them. You're the person she would have chosen, Margaux. I'm certain of it. The certainty in his voice was not the certainty of a man making a business offer. It was the certainty of a man who had listened to 500 hours of a woman reading to his wife and had come to understand, through the slow accumulation of words and tenderness and daily devotion, that this woman was extraordinary. Margaux cleaned her glasses on her cardigan. She looked at the sea. She looked at Alessio. She looked at the book in her hands, the last book she had read to Seraphina, and she thought about page 93 where it had all begun, a bookmark in an unfinished book in a hospital room. "Okay," she said, "but I have conditions." "Name them." "The reading chair in the back stays, and every Tuesday at 3 I host a reading for hospital patients. I'll go to them. I'll bring the books to them the way I brought books to Sarah. The shop funds it, non-negotiable." Alessio looked at this woman, this librarian, this reader, this quiet, extraordinary person who had walked into a hospital room 2 years ago because a book was open to page 93, and who had stayed every single day because that was who she was, because presence was her language, and books were her medium, and devotion was not something she performed, but something she was them. And he felt the ice in his chest crack one final time, not into grief, but into something warm, something alive, something that felt like the beginning of a story that Seraphina herself would have wanted to read. "Non-negotiable," he agreed. In the months between the funeral and the reopening of Pagina, something happened that Margaux had not anticipated. She became part of Alessio's world. Not the dark world, not the world of eastern districts and port operations and men who spoke his name with careful deference. The other world, the private one, the one that existed in his study at night when he read the book she recommended, in the kitchen of his apartment where he cooked simple meals and served them to her on mismatched plates because Seraphina had chosen the dishes and he could not replace them, in the long walks along the coastal road where they talked about books and grief and the specific quality of October light on the sea. She learned the geography of his loss. She learned that he could not listen to certain pieces of music because Seraphina had loved them. She learned that he kept his wedding ring on because removing it felt like a second loss. a voluntary amputation, and that the ring's presence on his finger was not a statement about his availability, but a memorial, a portable headstone that he carried everywhere. She learned that he slept poorly, that he woke at 3 a.m. and stood at the window looking at the city lights, that the hours between 3 and dawn were the hours when the grief was loudest and the absence of Seraphina most unbearable. She also learned that he was dangerous. Not from him. He was scrupulously careful about maintaining the wall between his personal and professional lives, but from observation, from the deference of the men who accompanied him to restaurants, from the way certain conversations stopped when he approached, from the quality of attention that people paid to him in public spaces. She understood, with the intelligence of a woman who read people as carefully as she read books, that Alessio Contarini was not simply a businessman with an interest in import-export. She understood, and she did not ask, because the answers would have introduced information that the fragile structure of their relationship could not yet support. He dealt with Tomas Varga during this period, not violently. The time for violence had passed when Seraphina died, when the target of Varga's aggression was removed from the world and the leverage that her coma had provided evaporated. He dealt with Varga strategically, dismantling his dock operations through a series of calculated moves that rerouted shipping contracts, disrupted supply chains, and systematically reduced Varga's organization to a fraction of its former capacity. It was not revenge exactly. It was consequence. It was the measured, patient, comprehensive response of a man who understood that justice does not require emotion, only precision. Varga left the city within 4 months, driven out not by threats, but by the slow, inexorable contraction of every source of income and influence he possessed. He left quietly, which was the worst kind of leaving in their world. It meant he had been beaten so thoroughly that even protest was beyond him. Alessio did not tell Margaux about Varga. He added it to the list of things he carried silently, the way she had once carried her daily visits to room 412, a private devotion, a debt paid in full, a chapter closed. She brought him books. That was how their relationship advanced, not through dates or declarations, but through an escalating exchange of books, each recommendation a form of disclosure, each title a window into the recommender's inner life. She gave him a novel about a man who builds a library in a war zone, and he understood that she was telling him about the power of words in hostile environments. He gave her a collection of essays about the sea, and she understood that he was telling her about the way grief ebbs and flows, never disappearing but changing shape with the tides. She gave him a slim volume of poetry by a woman who had lost a child, and when he read it, he called her at midnight and said nothing for a full minute, and she held the phone and listened to his silence, and the silence was its own form of communication, a shared language they were building from the ground up. 6 months later, Pagina reopened. Margaux stood behind the counter on opening day with a cup of tea and her glasses and her cardigan and a display of books she had curated, with the same care she had applied to 2 years of daily reading sessions. The shop was exactly as Seraphina had left it, except for one addition, a small framed photograph on the shelf behind the counter showing a dark-haired woman with high cheekbones and a slight smile, and beneath the photograph a handwritten card that read, "This shop was loved back to life. So was I." Alessio came to the shop every Wednesday. He bought books. He read them. He sat in the reading nook in the back and listened to Margaux help customers with the same passionate precision that Seraphina had brought to the work, and he fell in love. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but slowly, the way a person falls in love with a book they are reading for the second time, noticing things they missed before, finding depth where they had only seen surface, understanding that the story is richer and more complex than a single reading could reveal. He came every Wednesday. He sat in the reading nook, a small alcove that Seraphina had designed with 2 armchairs and a reading lamp and a low table for tea, a space that felt like the inside of a book, enclosed and warm and separate from the world, and he watched Margaux move through the shop with the fluency of someone who had found her natural habitat. She arranged displays with the same curatorial instinct she had applied to Seraphina's reading program, grouping books not by genre or author, but by mood, by need, by the question the reader might be asking without knowing how to articulate it. There was a table labeled "For When the World is Too Loud," and another labeled "For When You Need to Remember Why People Are Good," and a shelf near the door labeled "Start Here If You Haven't Read a Book in Years," that contained 7 carefully chosen titles designed to reawaken the reading impulse in people who had let it lapse. Customers loved her. They came back. They brought friends. The shop, which had been closed for over 2 years, developed a reputation that echoed its former glory. Not as a replacement for what Seraphina had built, but as a continuation, a second movement of the same symphony, played in a different key, but carrying the same essential melody. Margaux hung Seraphina's photograph behind the counter and talked about her to customers who asked. She said things like, "The woman who built this shop believed that books are not products, but conversations, and Seraphina would have recommended this one. She had a weakness for unreliable narrators and sea imagery." She kept Seraphina alive in the shop the way she had kept her alive in room 412. Through words, through presence, through the stubborn refusal to let someone disappear simply because they were no longer physically there. Alessio watched all of this. He watched and he admired and he felt the ice in his chest, the ice that had been there since the car struck Seraphina on a Tuesday evening, the ice that had frozen his capacity for joy and connection and hope, continue its slow, irreversible thaw. He told her on a Wednesday evening, after the shop had closed and they were sitting in the reading nook with empty teacups and a stack of new arrivals between them. He told her that he loved her, and the words felt strange in his mouth because he had not said them to anyone since Seraphina, since before the accident, since the world was a place where love was something he could offer without the fear that it would be destroyed by the violence of his own life. Margaux removed her glasses. She cleaned them on her cardigan. She put them back on. "I know," she said. "I've known for a while. I was waiting for you to catch up." He laughed. The sound surprised him. A real laugh, unpracticed, emerging from a place he had forgotten existed. She smiled, and the smile transformed her ordinary face into something radiant, something that reminded him of Seraphina, not because they looked alike, but because they both possessed the quality that Margaux had named in the hospital room 2 years ago, the ability to see an unfinished story and feel compelled to stay until it was complete. He reached across the stack of books and took her hand, and she let him. His fingers were long and scarred and warm, and hers were smaller and ink-stained and steady, and the contact between them was the culmination of something that had been building since page 93, since a woman walked into a hospital room and sat down beside a stranger and began to read. His thumb traced the ink stain on her index finger, the permanent mark of her profession, the evidence of a life spent handling books and knowledge, and the physical medium through which human thought becomes portable, shareable, eternal. "Seraphina brought me to books," he said, "and books brought me to you. The geometry of it is either beautiful or devastating, and I think it might be both." Margaux squeezed his hand. "It's definitely both. That's what all the best stories are." They sat in the reading nook of the bookshop that his wife had built and that this woman had brought back to life, and the evening light through the window fell across the shelves and the spines and the accumulated words of 1,000 authors. On the shelf behind the counter, Seraphina's photograph caught the last of the light, and her slight smile seemed, in that particular golden moment, to hold not grief, but permission. The permission of a woman who had loved books and believed that stories do not end when you close the cover, but continue in the lives of the people who read them. It was quiet, but it was not the quiet of a hospital room. It was the quiet of a library, the quiet of a place where stories live, the quiet of 2 people who had found each other through the oldest form of connection in the world, a voice, a listener, and the words that travel between them like light across the distance between stars. Thank you for staying with Margaux and Alessio and Seraphina through every page of this story. Thank you for understanding that love is not always romantic, that devotion is its own reward, and that the simple act of reading aloud to someone who cannot respond is one of the most powerful things a person can do. If this story moved you, subscribe to Crimson Vow Tales and hit that notification bell. Share this with someone who loves books, who loves stories, who understands that showing up every day is its own form of love. Drop a comment telling me the last book that made you cry. I read every single one. Until next time, remember, every unfinished book is waiting for someone to pick it up. Be the person who finishes the story.